guys, it's Claire. Welcome back. Today we're here to talk about our favorite reads of 2021, and I am joined once again by my brother Sam, who appeared on a video on the channel over a year ago, last year I think, although we filmed it 2 years ago at Christmas. We're back in California visiting Grandma for Christmas, and so we are filming another video, and I thought it would be fun to talk about our favorite reads of the year, because in the last video we did together, we talked about books that I had recommended to Sam that he had read, and some people were like, we want to know what Sam's reading taste is. And so today we're going to do that, and I thought that we could go through our top books of the year from least favorite to most favorite, and I thought that we could talk about why we loved them, and then also if we would recommend them to each other specifically. I feel like generally we would highly recommend all of these books, but keeping each other's reading taste in mind, we can decide if we would recommend the books to each other. Sam's dog is also near us. A couple of people last time complained that I had a tendency to talk over Sam, which I do think is my birthright as a middle child. But for the sake of the viewers, I'm going to try and contain myself this time. Before we get started, how many books did you read this year? And how many will you be talking about today?
Well, you said we're talking about 5, so I'm only talking about 5.
I think that was like a loose, like maybe 5. It wasn't a hard and fast thing.
I can throw in an honorable mention short story too.
Okay.
How many books did I read? I'm not sure, like 20-ish. For the last, I don't know what, 4 or 5 years, I've like set a goal of reading 24 books every year just to like keep things moving along and not like get to the end of the year and be like, oh no, I didn't like read anything this year. But I did not succeed in reaching my goal this year, and that's okay.
I read 33 books this year, not including books I've read for work. So a lighter reading year for me, but high quality reading, I would say, in looking back on it.
That's a lighter year for you.
Yeah, because I normally listen to more books on audio. I didn't listen to almost any audiobooks, so I feel like my number is normally closer to around 50, because my reading in past years has been about a third audiobooks.
Gotcha.
For you, was it a good reading year, you would say?
It was fine. Like last year was bad. Like we were talking about doing this last year, and I was looking at the things that I had read, and I was like, ooh, this is like not a great year. Whereas when I went back and looked at the list of books for this year, I was like, oh, okay, there were like a couple of pretty good ones in here.
I have 7 books that I'm going to talk about. Sam has 5. So I thought I would start with 2 of mine, and then we'll go back and forth. So my first best book of 2021 is Firekeepers' Daughter by Angeline Boulley, which is a YA book that came out this year. It follows a girl named Donis who lives in the UP of Michigan. She is white on her mom's side and Ojibwe on her dad's side, and she plays hockey, and there is this like meth ring moving through the like junior hockey leagues of the upper Midwest, and so she ends up helping investigate that. It's coming of age, it's about grief and losing people, and also it's a bit of a sort of mystery thriller. I would say I don't read YA that often, and the sort of getting pulled into a story that is like YA at its best, where it kind of reminds you of why you liked reading as a kid, is what I really liked about it. Also, the hockey stuff was fun, and I think that the sort of exploration of where she fits into her community in terms of the elders in the Ojibwe community, and also just kind of straddling multiple worlds. There's a lot of grief stuff in this book that I think is really moving in a way that was more powerful than I was expecting from a YA novel. And it was also just kind of a page turner, because you're trying to figure out what's going on with the meth. So I don't know that I would recommend that for you, because
it's YA.
Because it's YA, even though we like to be open-minded about genres generally. But I think that Sam is a little bit more like, you have to convince him to be emotionally moved. So I don't know if you would be as moved by it as I was, but it is a book that I've recommended to Mom, because I think she would like it a lot. Okay. And I feel like you could be into the hockey stuff, but also maybe like a young girl's coming of age.
Does anybody get beaten to death with a hockey stick?
No, but they do have blanket parties where the women in the community will take guys who've done bad things out to the woods and like wrap them in a blanket and beat them up.
Oh,
or she's told that that happens, but her aunt is like, you can't come. Not yet.
I still have a soft spot in my heart for like looking for Alaska.
That's true, yeah.
Could work.
And then the second book on my best books of 2021 list is Catch the Rabbit by Lana Bastašić. And this is translated from Serbo-Croatian by the author herself. And this is a book about two girls who are kind of in the middle of high school and in their teenage years when the war breaks out in the 90s in Yugoslavia. Well, okay, sorry. It follows a woman named Sarah who is living in Ireland when she's contacted by her best friend from childhood, Lila. Sarah is Christian, Lila is Muslim, and so they were affected by the war very differently. Sarah is only really affected by the war in the way that it affects Lila and her family, including Layla's brother Armin disappearing in the middle of the war. Many years after the war, Layla contacts Sarah and tells her that Armin is in Vienna and asks her to fly to Bosnia to drive her to Vienna to get Armin. And so the book is kind of this fever dream sort of road trip novel in which these two women who shared so much as teenagers but haven't spoken in over 10 years sort of reconnect. It's very tense and fractious. And this book has been compared a little bit to the Elena Ferrante books because the Sarah figure is very similar to the Elena figure in the Neapolitan novels, and then the Layla character is very similar to Lila in terms of being this sort of difficult figure that Sarah is trying to capture through writing, because Sarah is a writer in the book too. It was a book when I first started reading it. A lot of it is kind of overwritten and has a lot of metaphor and is just a lot sometimes where I was just like, oh, this is like so, there's so many metaphors being smashed into all of this. But I think as the book goes on, you see that Sarah is this person who is kind of in a position where she's trying to make sense and meaning out of what has happened, even though it didn't touch her as directly. And Layla is much more jaded and is like, there is no meaning in anything. I really liked it. I thought it was kind of maybe not a book for everyone because it's a little bit tricky and rough around the edges, but in a way that I think really works. And I think that you would really like it, or at least find it really interesting. And it's kind of a short, quick, really good, interesting translated fiction. Can we let Lila in?
I suppose. Come in, come in. Come in, come in.
Oh.
You were talking about Elena Ferrante earlier, and here is a dog named after
Lila. But not because Minjong was crazy about the character.
No.
More just because she liked the sound of it. Although she said that she's like Lila in the book because she's skinny, confident, and everyone is drawn to her.
I feel like I should start with an honorable mention for a short story.
Okay.
Not the whole book of short stories, but like one particular short story is Exhalation by Ted Chiang, which is a recommendation from you.
Did you read that whole book?
Yeah, I read the whole thing.
Oh.
But the short story Exhalation specifically is fantastic.
That was your favorite story in the book?
Probably. Exhalation is like just really wonderful. It's like this like very kind of like 18th century Victorian gentleman scientist like writing in a world that is like sealed inside of a giant chromium dome that they can't like drill through. This scientist, I think, is the one who discovers that like the pressure is slowly decreasing in their world and there's basically nothing that they can do about it. So it's like a little bit of a like has elements of climate change, but is a little more like kind of final and fatalistic than that. Right. In that they're just like, oh, okay, like we are going to experience the heat death of the universe a little faster than the squishy humans are going to.
So it's not so much about how do we fix this problem as it is like trying to understand existence and consciousness and what that means even when everything's about to end.
Oh, and there's also this wonderful sequence where he like takes apart his own brain while he's alive.
That's interesting that that's your favorite story from the book because I feel like I don't think about that one very often, but then when I think back on it, I'm like, oh yeah, that was quite good.
Yeah. It's very like, it's just like kind of a little like gem of a story. Like it's not really any plot. It's not really any arc. It's just sort of this little artifact that's like rendered really nicely.
On that note, I'm going to switch my number 4 and 5 just for the sake of continuity, because my 4th best book of the year is Exhalation by Ted Chiang. I read both of Ted Chiang's collections, which are basically all of his published work for the most part, and I loved both of them, Exhalation and Stories of Your Life and Others, but I think Exhalation was just better in terms of overall quality or the stories that you kind of think of. I think the sci-fi is a little bit more accessible in Exhalation and a little bit mathier and denser in Stories of Your Life and Others, so that's why I would recommend starting with Exhalation if you're new to Ted Chiang. But I think everyone should read it because I'm not a big sci-fi reader. Are you a big sci-fi reader? A little bit.
The values of the sci-fi community do not necessarily overlap with what I look for in books.
Interesting. Can you elaborate?
I like a lot of the ideas and things like that in sci-fi books, but then like often they're just very like plot focused and have terrible characters. And then the plot is often not that great either. And you're like, I don't know why I'm reading this.
Interesting. Yeah. So it's kind of like you need the ideas to also be as good as the form in which those ideas are explored and expressed.
Maybe.
Ted Chiang's stories don't necessarily have super strong characters, but I think what I find appealing about his sci-fi stories is that there is really economical, interesting, constantly surprising world building, and often in ways that you don't expect. Like the story in which people know the beginning of time because like tree rings stop at a certain point, and that's when you know that God created the universe, or that. Like there's basically signs in the universe where it's like God created the world at this time, and so it's a very kind of religious world, and then them finding out like what God actually thinks of the world. There's also a story in Stories of Your Life where it's about angels making visitations on Earth, but when angels visit, they kill like people in the vicinity just with the impact of like, people. Yeah. So people are constantly looking forward to these things, but also it's sort of this terrifying Old Testament, like when an angel visits, somebody in the area is going to get like shrapnel in the neck or something like that. I feel like all of that type of stuff is so imaginative and so different than what I'm used to in sci-fi, and the way that he kind of combines science and faith and religion, just the ideas and the tone and just how interesting and surprising and just perfectly economically crafted these worlds are within the walls of these small stories. I find just constantly impressive and exciting, and also just a balm for the soul.
Yeah, Ted Chiang is an excellent craftsman of basically what you're talking about. These very like kind of tight objects of short stories.
So I recommend more Ted Chiang for Sam and Ted Chiang for everyone else out there.
Okay, so the first actual book on the list is The Sleepwalkers by Arthur Kessler. He also wrote Darkness at Noon. He was like a Hungarian British kind of like literary guy, staunch critic of the Soviet Union, things like that. But it is a history of Copernicus, Kepler, and Galileo, and is I read this and then I read The Structure of Scientific Revolutions by Thomas Kuhn immediately after it, because they are like extremely similar books. But The Sleepwalkers is much more fun and also quite a bit longer. So it's basically kind of it is like sort of walking through the history of how these different guys figured out that like the solar system is heliocentric rather than being centered around the Earth in the case of Copernicus, or like how Kepler like came up with his laws of planetary motion and things like that. And it's filled with like a lot of really kind of interesting, fun biographical details. So like Copernicus is like this recluse monk living in some tower on like the edge of a swamp, and there's like kind of a very close reading of like a lot of Kepler's notes and things like that that just sort of like lay out how messy and imperfect and like kind of ridiculous all of these like scientific guys were. And there's also just like some really banging quotes from this guy too. Like, what was it? Oh yeah, he was like talking about Plato's philosophy. He was like, it's like the half-frightened, half-arrogant philosophy of the genius of a doomed aristocracy and a bankrupt civilization. And you're just like, oh yeah, this is like old school, very macho rhetoric, but it's kind of fun.
Would you recommend it to me?
Probably not, no.
Why?
Does it seem like something that you're interested in?
Not really,
Well,
but
there you
I'm
go.
glad that you enjoyed it. Maybe someone out there will too. Next up, I'm going back to my number 5 pick, which is Sorrow and Bliss by Meg Mason, which I recently raved about on my channel in a video in my Best Books of Fall video. And this is a book about a British woman who just turned 40 and her 8-year marriage to this guy named Patrick has crumbled. Her name is Martha, and it kind of looks back at her adolescence and early adulthood and kind of a mental illness that she first starts struggling with when she's a teenager. She also meets Patrick when she's a teenager, and it kind of follows her through her life up to the point of her marriage falling apart and sort of how those things affect each other. But it's just a book that feels like a comfort read, like it's cozy. It has that very British kind of ironic sense of humor. She's got all these not kooky, but sort of somewhat eccentric parents and sort of these side characters that populate the book. It's following an ordinary woman who's struggling with something that is a very isolating thing that feels very specific and very devastating to her. And so she can be awful and very hard to sympathize with, but I think you empathize with her because you spend so much time in her narration. It kind of does this 1-2 punch where you don't know what the book is about or what you're reading about. It's like, oh, I'm just following Martha along. It's kind of funny. It's kind of a cozy, like funny British book. And then it's like, oh my God, I've been emotionally winded because this book is just quietly devastating. Carrie Fisher had a quote that was like, if my life wasn't funny, then it would just be true, and that is unacceptable. That's a little bit of the vibe of this book. So I really loved it, and I feel like I've recommended it to a lot of friends. I don't know if I would recommend it to you, because I think what I appreciate about it in terms of the narration and kind of the wit and that quality of it, I don't know if that is like what you're looking for on a literary level or what you admire most in books, if that makes sense.
No, I feel like I can appreciate a witty, interesting narrator. A little bit of British charm sprinkled all over
Yeah.
all of the somewhat grim things
Yeah.
that are happening in the book, it sounds like.
Yeah. What's your next book?
All right, next book is Red Sorghum by Mo Yan. I had a little bit of a theme this year where I was like, okay, I'm going to make a deliberate attempt to like find some good things by Chinese authors in particular, because I feel like there's not that much that like actually makes it over to the West. Like Mo Yan obviously is like the big exception to that. But yeah, no, this is quite the wild ride of a book. The story is basically like kind of a couple of different threads that are following the narrator's like grandfather and then father, and kind of one thread is like their village in Shandong being like attacked by the Japanese, and then kind of like follows his father in the aftermath of that, but then also is like circling back and talking about his grandfather and grandmother when they were young. It's just a very like colorful, very like it seems much larger than life, but is also very kind of fun too. It's also like ridiculously violent and gory, like which I guess is like probably a reasonable depiction of what was happening in China when the Japanese were invading and massacring their way across the continent. So, you know, it is like macho literary dude prose, like very strong narrative voice, lots of like cutting back and forth between different timelines and things like that, and you're just like, oh yeah, this is like kind of bait for people who are into that sort of thing. But it is done very well for kind of what it is. Would I recommend it to you? Maybe. It's definitely outside of your normal like wheelhouse, but
I like reading books in translation, and so I like the idea that you have been reading or trying to read like Chinese authors. My number 3 book of the year, I almost put it at number 1 just to try and get more people to read it, but it is the only nonfiction book on this list, and it is Playing Indian by Philip J. Deloria. Phil Deloria is the son of Vine Deloria Jr., who was like a Native activist in the 60s and 70s and wrote a sort of polemic called Custer Died for Your Sins. It is like the published version of Phil Deloria's thesis, in which he looked at how co-opting certain aspects of Indigenous culture and Indigenous history has helped white Americans create a very specific kind of American identity that is in opposition to British or old European culture, kind of how they used sort of the quality of indigeneity to form what they thought of as American, but how Americanness is also predicated on this idea of Native Americans not existing and sort of the vanishing Indian, depending on that in order to form an identity, but also needing it to not be there, because then that identity would also have to include like genocide and all of the things that white Americans do not want to acknowledge as being fundamental to what American identity is. And so it basically looks specifically at kind of the history of people co-opting Native dress and names and that type of thing. It's a slim book, it's quite academic, but it is just so rewarding and it's so well written. And I think you would find it interesting because I think it's prevalent throughout America, but where we grew up in Wisconsin, there is a lot of like claiming certain kinds of Native history by white people, in that like we are from a part of Wisconsin with a lot of mounds, like burial mounds and effigy mounds, which are from like thousands of years ago. And like the Hoard Historical Museum is really into like this whole mounds exhibit. And also in the book he talks about buckskin clubs and buckskin gatherings, which I was like, oh, when we were kids,
the Buckskinners
Rendezvous was
through town
this
every year.
Traveling sort of prairie frontier reenactment, almost like a Renaissance festival, but like frontier. People would set up teepees, they would try and make canoes out of tree stumps. So that is something where it's like, oh, I'm sure if you looked at like the history of that type of thing, it is 100% connected to like what he's talking about in that book. And so the Buckskinner's Rendezvous of it all might be interesting. But it's a phenomenal book. I really, even if you just check it out and read the first chapter, like the introduction and the conclusion, really good.
So next up is Piranesi by Susanna Clarke.
I have heard so much about this book and so many people love it, and I still don't know what it's about.
So, okay, without being too spoilery, the premise is that there is a guy named Piranesi, I don't think that's a spoiler, who, sort of similar to the narrator in Exhalation, is a very scientifical, gentlemanly type, but he is living in a very strange, he calls it a house, but it's basically like something out of a Borges short story, where it's this like endless structure full of like halls made out of marble with tons of like niches and giant statues in them that just go on as far as he can tell forever. And there are these like tides that kind of move through the building, so some of the halls are like always submerged and some of them flood periodically, and he like undertakes these very detailed studies of the tides, so he knows exactly when like different areas are going to flood and things like that. And he's like writing all of this down in journals, being very scientific about the things that he finds, and he's also got a lot of affection for like the house as a whole. And then there are a couple of little details that start to like poke into the plot, where like, you know, he has like a rubber sheet and you're like, wait, where did that come from? He ends up with a pair of tennis shoes, and you're like, huh? And I think I should probably just like stop talking about the plot at that point, but that's kind of the setup. But yeah, it's like very well crafted. Like the narrative voice is like super strong and consistent like the whole way through. You know, it's a very like kind of straightforward plot driven, like you have these sort of anomalies that crop up and then they kind of break his understanding of the world that he's in or whatever, and he has to figure out what's going on with that.
Interesting. Okay, I need to get to that one.
Yeah. So there you go. There is something in the like kind of fantasy sci-fi bucket that I do actually like. So
my second best book of the year is a book that I finished mere days ago and was reading on the plane here, and then over the kind of first couple days we were here. Mom has since picked up my library copy and read it and also liked it. It is Medicine Walk by Richard Wagamese, and it was so good. And I wasn't expecting when I started it for it to be such a wonderful read by the end of it. It's kind of a little bit of a slow start, but it basically follows this kid named Franklin Starlight who is 16 years old. He doesn't have a mother, and he's been primarily raised by this guy who he refers to as the old man on this farm in, I think, Alberta his whole life. And his dad is an alcoholic who has kind of been in and out a couple of times just kind of to visit and say hi, but has not been a big figure in his life at all. And so Franklin is this sort of self-sufficient kid who knows how to hunt and farm and kind of all of this stuff. And then he gets a sort of summons from his dad, who is dying of alcoholism, and his dad is like on his last legs and wants him to take him up to this ridge in the mountains and kind of sit with him until he dies, and then bury him in the warrior style, which is sitting upright facing the east. And so they basically kind of embark on this multiple day journey, sort of slowly making their way up into the mountains. And it is sort of the story of Franklin and also the story of his father, and the way that it unfolds is incredibly moving. By the time you get to the end of it and sort of all has been revealed, it's just like, oh, there were many broken hearts scribbled in the margins of my library book in pencil. I have read one other book by Richard Wagamese called Indian Horse that I would really recommend to you, because it's about hockey and Canada and residential schools, but it's just, that's a really beautiful book. And I was not expecting Medicine Walk to be even better, but it was. And it was just like, I don't even care. I couldn't care less about fathers and sons, like not something that's interesting to me. And so I was not expecting this book to just like hit me in the gut. The way that he captures the way that men communicate and the way that they often communicate insufficiently is really beautiful and was very moving to me. And like the way it explores what it means to be like a father or a son or like a parent or a child is really incredibly moving, especially the juxtaposition between Frank and his dad, and then Frank and the old man who raises him. And like, oh, there's some stuff at the end of just like this sort of, you know, like short clipped man and little man exchanging, the way that they're like telling each other they love each other without actually saying it because they're like emotionally stunted. I just love Richard Wagamese. I finished this book and then went and ordered like 5 more of his books that will hopefully be waiting for me when I get home, because I think this one solidified that I want to read all of his books. And he is a very, I think, beloved Canadian First Nations writer who like died quite young. I think he was only 61 and he died a few years ago, so that's too bad. But so I highly recommend this for you and for anybody.
So number 2 is The Overstory by Richard Powers. So The Overstory is billed as a book about trees, which is probably not actually accurate. It's really like a bunch of kind of individual threads about people who all have very intimate relationships with trees in various ways, and they kind of all start out very disparate, and some of them sort of come together for a while and then they kind of branch out again.
Well, and the reason Sam needed to make that, sorry to interrupt, the reason you needed to make that qualification was because I got this book for our dad who is obsessed with trees, and he finished it, and I was like, oh, what did you think? I got it for him because everyone is like, this is a book about trees, and I feel like for the average person, it is a book about trees, and he finishes it, and he's like, well, I thought this was a book about trees. This is a book about people.
It really, especially in the beginning, reads like some really nicely done short stories that are very good at, like in kind of a Stephen King-y way, are very good at getting you sort of up to speed and empathetic with a bunch of very different characters, like really fast. And there's also just a lot of really wonderful kind of long descriptions of like all sorts of different trees. Like there's this chestnut that's growing on a farm in Iowa that kind of escapes the chestnut blight for a long time and grows into just this enormous, like 100-foot tall thing that's out in the middle of a field all by itself. A lot of really kind of wonderful like nature writing and things like that, coupled with these like pretty nice like story threads of these different characters who are all kind of like trying to, a lot of them are trying to do their best to preserve these creatures that are much, much older than all of them. And it really like I would not describe, you wouldn't describe me as like a particularly like tree huggery person at all, right? And this is the kind of book where I think like what impresses me about it the most is that by the end of it, you're very much like, I almost want to become an eco-terrorist to like keep people from cutting down redwoods or whatever. And it's like, okay, that's not my natural inclination, but you really like kind of hooked me with like the kind of outrageousness with which a lot of humans are treating the natural world. So yeah, it is an excellent book. And one that I think achieves that rare trick of actually like kind of getting you to empathize with people who you might not empathize with on the surface, or you wouldn't expect to, and that's like quite the strong move, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I read the first 3 chapters of this a couple of years ago, and I loved the first chapter, which was about the American chestnut, which our dad has talked about many times. And so I loved that chapter and recommended it to Dad based on that, because he's talked about chestnut trees so much. I'm like, what I wouldn't give to live in a world where the American chestnut was still around. Then I think I got to the 3rd chapter where it's like the guy with 3 daughters.
Yeah.
And I think it was narrated by one of the kids, and I just didn't like the kids' narration. And so then I put the book down and never picked it back up. But this is making me want to pick it back up again.
You should, because that kid grows up into an adult.
Okay, yeah.
It is not substantially narrated from a child's perspective.
My best book of the year, perhaps no surprise to anyone, because I've recommended it to many people through this channel and also just in my life, including to Sam, who has read it but apparently didn't like it enough to put it on the list.
I did.
My best book of the year is A Brightness Long Ago by Gavriel, which I've talked about at length. It is kind of an alternate Europe historical fantasy book that is set in an equivalent to Renaissance Italy. It's narrated by a man named Danio, who is looking back on his youth and this kind of bright moment in his early adulthood where he sort of came into the path of great figures of his time, and him reflecting on youth and history and memory. It's really beautiful. It's very tender. It's very well written. It is kind of one of those, again, just like a perfect contained story. And I think it has some incredibly beautiful scenes and set pieces in it. Like there's a big horse race at the middle of the book that's just wonderful. And then I think as it goes on, the sort of way that it is nostalgic and sentimental without being overwrought and like cheesy is just like, when a book or a movie can do that right, it's just like absolute catnip to me.
It was quite good. I also liked it. I think really it's like all of the characters surrounding Danio. Danio himself is kind of like, he's a little flat compared to everybody else that he is around. Like Adria and, now I'm forgetting the 2 guys' names.
Falco and Montecola.
Yes, Falco
Teobaldo.
Teobaldo Montecola, that's right.
And Falco.
Yes.
2 mercenary captains who hate each other.
Yeah, like the three of them are all very kind of colorful characters, and you know the story is largely concerned with the three of them kind of more so than the narrator himself.
Right.
He's almost like Nick in The Great Gatsby.
Yes, yeah.
To some extent.
But I think his narration, like, I think he is purposely obscuring like himself, because as you get further in the book, you get a sense of like who he has become, and you don't quite get a clear picture of it. So it is a way in which he's reflecting on his youth while also being like, I was just a tailor's son, I was nobody, I was nothing. And it was like, and yet you keep finding yourself in these situations. Yeah. So,
and then in the end,
you know,
it's like,
he's a little bit of a cagey narrator, but I think he's a good vessel with which to explore those other characters. And I think that it's just beautifully done. And I think in that book, it's like he pulls out these little vignettes in which you get the perspective of different people. And I often forget about that when I'm remembering the book, where it's like during the horse race, you're primarily focused on Adria, who's one of the main characters, but then you get this flash of being in the perspective of the guy who she is trying to beat in the horse race. And it is so well done. And it's just like there's these little like jewels throughout the book like that that just make it so wonderful and so much like richer even than I remember thinking back on it now. So yeah, I love that book. I'm glad that you liked it, even if it didn't make your top books of the year.
Hello, Lila. What do you think about A Brightness Long Ago? Does it get 1 bark? 2 barks?
No barks.
No barks. Okay. Tough critic.
All right, Sam, what was your best book of the year?
Okay, so best book of the year is The 4 Books by Lianke. So this is another one of my I'm going to read Chinese fiction project books. And it is about a bunch of intellectuals, like artists, scholars, musicians, whatever, who are in a labor camp out in who knows where during the Great Leap Forward. And there is the kind of like government officer who runs the camp is this very like he's literally called the child, and the other characters are like the scholar, the author, the musician. I guess it is kind of a somewhat magical realist rendering of like what it was like to be in one of these camps, and it's also just like has elements of like kind of mysticism woven through it, where like the first opening chunk of the book is like kind of a retelling of Genesis, but it's just like the genesis of this labor camp. There are kind of these long sequences of just sort of the absurdity of the things that people were doing in these camps. A very kind of heady mix of like kind of magical elements and also just like, oh gosh, this place was completely bonkers, but also some of this probably happened in some form or other to somebody. And then it just takes like a really hard turn at the end where it's like, oh yeah, Great Leap Forward, right? There's a famine at the end of this.
Is that a spoiler?
I mean, I don't think it's a spoiler given that it's like based on historical events. But there are lots of like very grim but also moving like passages of the characters like trying to do anything that they can to like make it through the winter without dying. It's quite the ride. Very well written from like start to finish, and kind of not about something that I probably would have been reading normally.
Well, those were the best books that we read in 2021. Let us know if you have read any of the books that we mentioned today in the comments down below, and let us know what your favorite books of 2021 were. Sam, thanks for joining me again on the channel, and hope to have you back again on another winter break, perhaps.
at some year,
point, 2 years from now. As always, thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Bye.
Bye. Oh, wow.
Oh, here. Well, now she's gone. All right. Peace out.